I'm Andy Grotto from here at CSAC. I am delighted to welcome my old friend Jamil to campus. I've known Jamil 15 years, I think.
Probably about that long, yeah.
Yeah, so we worked in the Hill together way back when. And as it happens, we collaborated on a piece of legislation, the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act, that passed, I think, 3 years after we left the Hill, because that's just the way the Hill operates, which is up for reauthorization, right? So, it's full circle. Jamil is the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute at George Mason University, and he's an assistant professor of law and director of the National Security Law and Policy Program at the Antonin Scalia Law School at GMU. He teaches classes on counterterrorism, intelligence, surveillance, cybersecurity, and other national security matters. He also teaches a summer course in Padua, Italy, with
Prague this summer.
Prague, okay. Yeah. With Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch, who you clerked for earlier.
The oldest Supreme Court clerk in modern history. There was one older back in the day, but I don't think that's something to be proud of.
That's and wisest too. I'll give you that.
I don't know about that. That's definitely not true.
So Jamil is an affiliate here at CSAC and previously served as a visiting fellow at Hoover from 2016 to 2019. I'm going to turn it over to Jamil. Welcome. Right. Looking forward to hearing your talk.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Andy, and thanks to Harold and Scott and the entire crew for having me here. This talk and a version of this has been much too long in the coming. I've been associated with CSAC for a long time. I'm thrilled to be here finally presenting to all of you. I thought we'd talk a little today about regulation and innovation and the question of what the right approach is for our nation, for our states, for our allies around the globe as we look at the AI revolution going forward. I have to admit that I updated these slides on the flight here because the Stanford HAI report just came out, and I want to have the latest data from the August institution where I'm speaking. So I want to make sure that you know that if I get the data wrong, if you're from HAI and I get your data wrong, please tell me, object, criticize. I have to take it. So look, we all know about the generative AI boom. What we sometimes forget is that this generative AI boom began just in 2022. It was November 22 when generative AI from ChatGPT hit the scene in a big way, came out for public release, and we've seen a massive acceleration. AI adoption was already fairly high between 2017 and 2022. It already reached 50% for at least one function, corporate users surveyed by McKinsey. But that effort has skyrocketed since the public release of ChatGPT, and then all the other models we've seen since then, whether Gemini, Llama, you name it, Anthropic's Claude, or the like. We've seen a massive acceleration from nearly 30% at the beginning of 2023 up to 71% today, 78% AI more generally. So we're seeing massive increase in the use of AI across corporate America. Oh, that's the wrong direction. Let's go the other way. All right. And the capabilities of these models has skyrocketed dramatically. You can see along a variety of models, including some evaluation metrics, including some that have been created recently in response to the generative AI revolution, the LLM revolution. You can see the rate of increase in capabilities that's taking place across these AI models. It is dramatic. It is significant. It is moving the needle in a big way. And these are, by the way, the human baseline is up there at 100% right there. So you can see a number of these models on a variety of tests are now starting to either hit or exceed the human baseline across a variety of metrics. So that acceleration has been significant, and it's getting to the point where we're getting to what you might call a version of artificial general intelligence. All right, so I'm on the wrong direction. Here we go. All right, so the market size of AI is also growing worldwide. You can see it in 2020 around 93 billion US dollars. It's going to accelerate over time. Right now, we're in 2025, looking at about 2.5x that. It's going to accelerate to a huge portion above that over the next decade or so, or the next 5 years, in fact. All right, private investment has come alongside and generated a lot of this innovation. We see spikes in 2021, but as a general matter, the trend is directly up, and that number is likely to be exceeded this year going forward. So private investment in AI generally is accelerating. And private investment in generative AI specifically is on a directly upward trend. We can see it accelerating from almost nothing in 2019, dramatic increases in 23 and 24. That's likely to continue as well. And if you look at it, it's not just private investment. Private investment is a key portion of this investment. It's the green bar you see below there. but you're also seeing a number of exits for these VCs that have invested early on in generative AI and AI generally. And so the blue bar, you see the merger and acquisition, are the exits that are being driven by the early venture capital invested. You'll see that number continue to increase as well as some of these mergers acquisitions accelerate and as the investment below also increases. So you're seeing the money come in early, and that's going to grow. It's going to generate longer, bigger returns on the back end, as we've seen here. And in fact, unicorns have been born in a significant portion out of the AI revolution. The last year alone, unicorns, of all the unicorns globally, 44% had an AI component to them. Not driven purely by AI, but that's been a significant portion. It's been increasing over time. Some exceptions to that rule. But after the generative AI boom in 22, you see acceleration in 23 and 24. So these, again, are demonstrating the exits for the venture capitalists that invested early on in generative AI. This trend will likely continue as well. All right, and we look at where that investment is coming from. If you look at geographic areas across the globe and you sum it up across the last decade plus, what you see is the United States far outstrips any other nation investment in AI by orders of magnitude, right? 4 to 5x above China, right? Even if you total up Europe, it doesn't come even close, and that's in billions of US dollars. Same thing, you see this is a different metric, different way to look at the same analysis, right? This is just looking at the US, Europe, and China. You can see, again, the US orders of magnitude above all these other players in this space. If you think about it, it's actually generated results, right? This investment has generated results. The number of notable AI models in the US far outstrips all other jurisdictions. And if you look at it across, not just in this year alone, right? It outstrips China by 3x this year alone, or a little less than 3x. You see the same thing happening across the board. It was a little tighter back in the early 2000s, but starting in 2012 and really 2015, the US accelerated on the generation of the most capable novel models out there. It doesn't mean to suggest that China isn't accelerating as well. As you can see, the trend line for China is upwards as well. Europe, on the other hand, is starting to trend downwards. And if you look at it by sector, what's really driving this, and again, this tells the story of the private investment and the private capital markets in the United States, it's industry. While academia is generating a lot of the early results, a lot of the publications, a lot of the data, where the models are coming from is primarily out of industry. And you see that acceleration again, private investment dollars coming in the early 2015, 2016 era, and accelerating that. And then with the generative AI boom, you see that accelerating up to hugely high rates in just the last couple of years. And again, to be seen whether that trend line holds, but at least that's the trend line we're seeing right now. Again, most of this data you're seeing, by the way, is from the Stanford HI report, worth checking out, just came out in the last couple of days. And if you look at who's generating across the globe, right? It's Google, Meta, Microsoft, OpenAI, Carnegie Mellon, Stanford, and then Tsinghua. And then after Tsinghua, Berkeley, NVIDIA, Oxford, MIT, Salesforce. The thing to note here, this is almost all American. Every major research institute, with the exception of Tsinghua and Oxford and Alibaba down at the bottom, every company, every entity on this chart is American, save those three. This is, again, based on number of notable AI models. And not surprisingly, if you look at where the US ranks in terms of talent, research, R&D, a little lower on adoption data and hardware, we win across the board. This has been the trend going forward. This is 2021 data. The trend remains true to this day. And yet, right as those new AI models hit, we heard from some of the leading experts, including the CEOs of OpenAI, DeepMind, and Anthropic, that mitigating the risk of extinction from AI, extinction, should be a global priority along societal scale risks like pandemics and nuclear war. What's going on here? We're rapidly increasing the development of AI capabilities, and leading AI thinkers in 2023, just a few months after that, after it hit the public scene, OpenAI's ChatGPT hit the public scene in November 2022, came out with a statement that was extreme by some measures. Well, there are a lot of risks and threats when you think about AI, right? We talk about privacy questions of cyber and data security, misinformation, scams, deepfakes, manipulation of data, discrimination bias, the worry about autonomous weapons, surveillance, impacts on our workforce, and of course, the infamous Skynet problem, right? Will the machines take over and run the world and kill all of us? Right? These are not just made up concerns. These are concerns that pull dramatically across the US, across Europe, with lawmakers and the like. We'll hear more about that in a second. But these are very real threats. These are non-trivial concerns about AI. The question is, what, if anything, should policymakers do about these threats, and how should they behave in response to the very real fact that these are not only threats that exist in the world, but that are concerns amongst their populations? So we just look at what's happening in academia. Papers on responsible AI and the need for responsible AI have skyrocketed in recent years, going from 329 in 2019 to 4 times that in 2024. So there's a concern, a discussion in academia about the need for ensuring that AI is created and utilized in a responsible manner. The US, interestingly enough, is driving that trend. It's US academics, like the folks in this room, that are driving the trend. It's both in terms of the papers that are accepted at conferences in this year alone, but also across the board. And it's been true since 2019. Since we started measuring this data, it's been true that the US has led on the question about responsible AI, with an acceleration after the adoption of ChatGPT in 2022 and these statements by big players like the CEOs of some of these major companies. And to be fair, the number of AI incidents, while a small n, right, 233 at last measure, has increased over time. We might debate how AI incidents are measured, what the scope of them is, how problematic they are, but there's definitely a trend that's going in the direction of that should be concerning to those of us who are thinking about AI, trust, safety, and security. Well, so we've had some policymakers weigh in, right? Lina Khan, right, formerly the chairwoman of the FTC, came out in February 2023 and indicated that she was deeply concerned about the role of big tech and the role that Washington should play. Her view is we need to get in the game and regulate now. She doubled down on this in February 2025, talking about the impact of AI and lauding it, but at the same time suggesting that big tech companies and growing AI tech companies were starting to control the marketplace, and that there was a need for further regulation. Of course, she's no longer, at this point, is no longer in office, but her views continue to shape the debate around AI. We'll talk about what the other side's views are as well. This view, by the way, this concern about AI is reflected in the American population as well. About half of Americans support more regulation of big tech companies generally. And not surprisingly, Democrats are more likely than Republicans to say major tech companies should be regulated, but the numbers are close. The numbers are close, both in terms of the quantity's been fairly stable since 2018 to the present era. Right around half the American public thinks we had to regulate big tech companies more. And remember, big tech companies, generally we're talking about the big 5, but now increasingly when people think of big tech, they do think of some of the AI companies. And when you look at the difference between Democrats and Republicans, while Democrats are higher, right, 60% to 45 against Republicans, we also need to take account of the modern evolution of the Republican Party and the trends that we're seeing with the Trump type of Republican Party, which I think will narrow this trend even further. We've seen a Lina Khan-like trend amongst MAGA Republicans on Capitol Hill, joining hands with liberal Democrats to advocate in favor of big tech regulation, including potentially AI regulation. And the fact is that Americans tend to have more negative than positive views about AI's impact on US society, right? They're worried about the spread of false information. They're worried about reducing social connections. They're worried about good jobs. They're worried about national security. They're less worried about criminality and medical diagnosis, but they actually think that AI will have a net positive impact by 60% on medical diagnoses. But across these other things, they are concerned. The American public is concerned. So it's not just folks out there talking about it. It's not just a inherent regulatory motivation. This number, this poll taken in between November and December of last year, demonstrates that the American people are in fact concerned about the impact of AI on their day-to-day life, and not necessarily in a good way. All right, Congress has responded at least at some level. 221 bills proposed in 2024 alone. That's a dramatic increase over the baseline numbers. 2022, that number started rising, but not surprisingly, as those of you who follow Washington, D.C. know, Congress has done very little, right? I'm going to argue this is a good thing, but more to come. They've only passed 4 bills, 221 proposed. They passed 4 in 2024. Looking backwards, that number stayed about stable, just above 0, right? So a small number of bills passed, a lot of bills introduced, an accelerating trend. Regulations, because Congress hasn't been able to get stuff done, the executive branch has taken action. So without sort of the normal legislative process going forward, the executive branch has moved, and under the Biden administration has accelerated regulations Up a lot of these around how the federal government uses AI, so not direct necessarily regulation of industry, but how the federal government uses it. There was some regulatory impact of the AI executive order that we can talk more about later. But the main thing to note here is that where Congress has not stepped in, the federal government at the executive branch has at some level. And in fact, local officials share the same concern, right? Local officials in a poll taken as part of the AI index that Stanford put out, right? Local officials indicate they think that for the 2025 to 2050 period, the next 25 years, 80% of them think stricter data privacy regulations are critical. Retraining for the unemployed, AI deployment regulations, stronger antitrust rules. These are all the things that poll above 50%. Bias audits for hiring and promotion AI, parole and sentencing AI regulations. So state and local officials are concerned and are reflecting the concerns of their constituents as well when it comes to AI safety, security, and trust. And state level AI bills have skyrocketed as well. California leading the march with 42 bills over the 2016-2024 period, but Virginia not far behind, and Utah and Maryland with 17 apiece. But they are, I guess they are far behind, but relative to California, but everybody's far behind relative to California. Now, again, this doesn't talk about scale, scope, and nature. Of course, you all know that the major piece of California AI regulation, which passed by overwhelming majorities in both houses, was vetoed by the Democratic governor. So there is some debate in California about how far to go. But the trend line for California when it comes to percentage of AI job postings is going the wrong direction. Some would debate whether it's because of AI regulation, tax policy, other challenges. We all know about the flight from California to other jurisdictions in the post-pandemic era. You all know that better than anybody. But the number has dropped significantly, and Texas, unsurprisingly, has gained significant ground. We could again debate state income tax. We can debate causation and correlation. I'm demonstrating a lot of correlation in this, and the biggest criticism of my presentation video, this is a lot of correlation, no real causation. I will give you that up front. I admit it up front. We could debate all those issues, but the trend is clearly concerning, at least for California, being the home of tech innovation and right here in the Silicon Valley. All right, so what is happening globally on this front? You all know about the EU AI Act, 113 pages, over nearly 200 recitals and provisions. I mean, we're talking about a massive piece of regulation, a massive piece of legislation leading to regulation. Now, the Europeans, to the extent that they decide to regulate, they did it in a nuanced, somewhat nuanced way. They categorized risk into high, medium, and low. They put stronger regulations on high-risk activities, lesser regulations on low-risk activities, banned certain types of applications. But it's a big law. It's a big piece of regulation, and it's kind of consistent with the way that the EU looks at these things and the way the EU adopts. Regulate first, innovate later. And here we are, right? We have prohibited systems that have already been banned as of a few months ago. Literacy requirements to be enforced, right? More high-risk regulations to go into place over the next 36 months. And so we're on the timeline at which we're starting to see compliance with the EU AI Act. All right, well, what is the modern what does the current U.S. administration think of this? Well, J.D. Vance went to Paris in February, and as we saw a few days later at Munich, gave the Europeans a strong lecture on his view on AI and the executive branch's view on AI. He made clear that his view was that excessive regulation can kill AI's transformative capabilities. He wants to remain free from ideological bias. He means something very specific by that. But he doesn't want hand-wringing. Right? This is, I think, the main view, at least of the current administration, of what the EU is doing, hand-wringing, and that American workers are going to be at the center of AI policy. A few weeks later in Washington, D.C. at the American Dynamism Summit, he talked about the importance and the history of American innovation, how we think about it, how we drive it, the policies that drive it, and made clear that this administration would lean forward on AI, would lean forward on AI adoption, and would essentially ban the words trust, safety, and security from its vocabulary if they viewed that as getting in the way of innovation. Now, that being said, OMB just put out a memorandum in the last 2 days that contains the words trust, safety, and security and requires use of trustworthy AI in federal government procurement and the like. So there's a little bit of a back and forth going on within the administration. There's some debate going on, but certainly as a matter of administration policy, the message is we're leaning forward. We're not going to lean backwards. We're not going to regulate. And to be seen what they do with all the bills up on Capitol Hill that are proposing regulation. All right. Well, what is this regulatory, regulate first versus innovate first environment do for financing and for growth? Well, if you look at VC financing, 63% of VC financing in AI and frontier tech between 21 and 2024 was in the US, 15% in Europe. Quantum computing, 42% in the US, 34% in Europe. Deep tech and health, 55% in the US, 30% in Europe. It's not just AI, but AI is a big piece of it. American venture capitalists are dramatically outstripping Europeans when it comes to investment. And you look at the results. US GDP, maybe until last week, is growing, far outstripping the EU on a downward trend, China, of course, on a massive upward trend. We'll see how the tariffs and the new policies of the current administration play out. But this is, as a share of global GDP, the role the US relative to the EU plays. And the numbers don't lie, right? If you look at global GDP growth, it's accelerating, the US accelerating, the EU and Japan also accelerating, but not by the same margins. The US has led and continues to lead for many, many years. That trend continues forward. It's because of our innovation base. Real GDP growth compared to the EU was zooming in between 2020 and 2022. Same story, right? Rapid trends up for both of us, but the US continues to lead well ahead of Europe in growth numbers. GDP per capita, same trend, if not even stronger, between 1960 and 2020. Right? The US constantly on upward march, the EU a little bit more of a mixed bag, and in recent years on a dramatic upward march, particularly even in the post-pandemic era. Unemployment rates tell the same story. The US at historic lows, EU always outstripping when you talk about the euro area at 6.3%, or the EU 27 at 5.9, the US at 4.2. It's not close. There are some countries that beat the US: Ireland, Bulgaria, the Netherlands, Germany, Malta, Poland, Czechia, right? But that's it. Across the EU, the trend is against the Europeans when it comes to employment as well. Now, productivity growth tells a slightly different story. So there are some countervailing trends. Productivity growth has been better in the Eurozone and in the EU 27 than in the US. But net contributors to GDP still show the results. We have the IPOs. We have the venture capital investments. We're generating the revenue, even though productivity growth is growing at slower rates in the US than it is in Europe and the EU, both the EU 27 and the Eurozone. And again, the results just don't lie, right? You look at the largest companies by market cap, every single one of the top 10 US is double the largest European company. Double. Number 10 is 2x more than the largest European company. And if you look at the top 10, it's almost all tech companies. Apple, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Amazon, Alphabet, Meta, Tesla, Broadcom. The only two exceptions, Berkshire Hathaway and Eli Lilly. Numbers just don't lie. Tech innovation is driving the global economy, and the US is driving tech innovation and the global economy. And it's because we don't regulate first. We innovate first. All right, again, more data, right? From companies that started from scratch in the US and the EU that are less than 50-year-olds with more than 10 billion market cap. Again, you just look at the size of the numbers, it's not close. Same thing is true for unicorns. The total value from Silicon Valley alone, $1.2 trillion in unicorns. The EU, $338 billion. And as AI continues to make a larger impact on GDP, this trend will only accelerate if the United States doesn't make the same mistake that the Europeans have made. If the US takes advantage of where the American population is, where local officials are, where members of Congress are, and makes a move to regulate in a big way, we could undermine this very unique opportunity to not only grow our GDP and grow our GDP per capita, but accelerate dramatically with the adoption of generative AI globally and AI tools more generally. Again, the trend in the population is against that. Both in Europe and the US, AI as a technology that requires careful management, totally agree, 66% in Europe, higher in the United States, 72%. 72% totally agree that AI requires careful management. When you look at what have been key pieces of legislation in Europe for starting and scaling a technology company, Negative effects from the EU Cybersecurity Act, DMA, DSA, the EU AI Act, antitrust reviews across the board. EU regulation is the thing that is driving concerns among Europeans surveyed as to why their companies aren't growing and succeeding. Now, at the same time, it is driving companies to do more. It is true that when you regulate, companies will do more. So organizations that have been influenced by AI regulations, the GDPR is at the top of that list, the EU AI Act, other portions as well, including the US presidential executive order. So even things that are not strictly regulatory, the presidential EO largely focused on federal government activities. It did require some reporting from companies that had a regulatory effect, reported not to, but it did. But the truth is that it does drive decisions inside of companies. So these regulations have an impact. They cost companies money. The question is, how does it play out economically? And if you ask Europeans, they'll tell you, what is the biggest challenge to European success in technology for European tech to reach full potential? Regulatory reform, bureaucracy reduction, number one. Number two, investment capital funding dynamics. It's not surprising, investment flows to where it's likely to succeed. It's likely to succeed where there's less regulation. All the rest of it pulls a lot lower. Now, what's interesting is that the American public, again, is concerned about AI. The American public generally, the trend has been in the right direction. It's improved over the last 3 years by about a 4% margin. But the US still polls near the bottom of countries around the globe about whether AI will have a beneficial or a negative impact, right? The exceeding benefits and drawbacks question polls at about 35 to 40% in the United States. It's a pretty low number. And if you look at global opinions about products and services, whether people are excited about AI, 2024 data, the US on the far left, not the place you generally want to be. Bottom left is worse, top left ain't great. So other countries are much more forward-leaning. China, interestingly, 80% of Chinese surveyed are excited about AI. Only about 35% in the US. Same numbers as we saw back here, roughly speaking. So what does all this mean? Should we be worried about what will happen if, in fact, American policymakers don't take advantage of the opportunity they see amongst the American population? Concerns about AI, concerns about trust, safety, and security. Well, it turns out there's every reason to believe that private investors will account for these concerns. Why? Building trust into your AI capabilities will almost certainly deepen adoption and lead to longer dwell times by people using AI tools. Right? If you trust the tool you're building or the tool you're using, you're more likely to use it, you're more likely to stick with it. If you protect your users and you ensure that they're not getting incorrect answers or being misled by disinformation and misinformation, you're likely to increase adoption. And you see the American population is concerned. So it's likely the market will respond to that concern. And of course, if you secure your AI, make sure data is not leaking out of it and the like, right? You're going to protect both the investment that users are making in buying the tool, but you're also going to protect the investment that your venture capitalists are putting into it, protect the IP that they're investing in. So if you're securing from walking out the back door to a nation state actor or the like, you're more likely to defend that investment. So there are good reasons to believe that investors will incentivize the right things, the trust, safety, and security that the American people want to see. And it's worth letting that play out before taking the regulate first, innovate second approach of the Europeans. All right, that's the presentation.
Thanks. Well, I'll kick things off with an observation and a question before I open it up to the group. So JD Vance uses the phrase excessive regulation.
Yeah.
You use the phrase regulate in a big way. Those are both vague statements. I think if you were to ask European regulators, do you excessively regulate? Do you regulate in a big way? They would probably say no. So it seems to me that there's a question of degree.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that investors have major incentives to invest in companies that respect trust, safety, and security. And I think that's true. But again, it seems to me that the question isn't whether investors will account for those values, whether the vendors will account for those values, but whether they will account for them enough.
Yes.
So how do you answer that critique?
It's a great question. I actually thought you were going to give me the even harder question is why if investors are so good at trust safety security, why haven't they done that in the tech domain, and why is cybersecurity such a problem?
That's where my head is, but
right.
Yeah.
So we can come to that one next. But on this question, I think you're right. It's a question of degree, and we can look at what American light touch regulation might look like, right? So the Biden EO had a few provisions that looked like reporting requirements. They required companies to report on how they were securing their dual use foundational models, whether they had a certain level of compute, how they're securing that, the physical and cyber safeguards imposed upon the parameters for the model, the coefficients that were used in the model. So there were a lot of reporting requirements, but no actual direct regulation. No, you can't do above this, you can't do below that. There was some on compute, right, on the sale of chips overseas, but nothing directly. But as it turns out, if you're requiring people to report on what they're doing to engage in security activities, they're more likely to spend on that activity. If you require them to report on how often they're red teaming and what they're doing when they find problems when they're red teaming, they're going to spend more on that activity.
Why is that bad?
It's not a bad thing, right? The question is, without congressional involvement in that regulation, right, how do you know you got it right, right? If it's just an executive branch purely driven thing and it masquerades as a reporting requirement, how do you assess whether it's the right level of regulation, right? And part of the regulation set out a specific computing threshold that you need to report above. That was the baseline for what constituted a dual-use foundational model to use a certain amount of compute or a certain amount of computing power in a single location with a certain amount of network transport bandwidth on the back end, right? How do you know if you have those numbers right? Ben Buchanan's a very smart guy, right? He helped put those numbers in. How do you know when industry exceeds those, right? And yes, they created a process by which the regulatory state would look at these questions and evaluate, but without the testing of the political system, right, the legislative branches and the like, and that debate in Congress, and frankly the horse trading that goes on, how do you know you're in the ballpark of getting it right? And to me, that's the biggest concern. If you look at the large trends of American tech innovation, it's all in favor of almost no regulation. No legislation. You look at the development of software in Silicon Valley, the only type of legislation that the state of California largely engaged in was freeing up people to move from place to place, from job to job, right? Making a more conducive environment to tech transfer, to innovation, to investment. That's changing in the state of California. It's changing. It's a long-term trend in California. But at a national level, we did the same thing. We didn't regulate. And it's part of what in my view, and again, causation, correlation doesn't imply causation or doesn't demonstrate causation. But I think there's a strong argument. If you look at the nation states and the zones in which regulation is heavy, innovation just doesn't happen at the same rates. Investment doesn't happen at the same rates. It's not by accident. There are plenty of venture capitalists and plenty of LPs in American venture capital funds.
I don't think anybody would disagree with that, right? It's a question of, what is the trade? Where is the right strike point for a trade-off between innovation on the one hand and some of these other public values? So what I'm pushing is, how do you find that line?
So that's a great question. So if the U.S. and California historically is zero, and the EU and the DMA, the DSA, EU antitrust regulation, and now the EU Act is 100 or 90, right? The answer is probably somewhere in the middle, right? And the answer is probably closer to 20 to 30 than it is closer to above 50, in my view, right? In terms of how much regulation, the weight and nature and scale. And then there's the separate question is, okay, well, how do you achieve that, right? What might be the ways you would go about this, right? The U.S. general trend is and the general trend among economists is you don't regulate until you know there's a problem, right? You have deadweight loss, you have a tragedy of the commons, right? You have one of these sort of unique problems that engenders regulation. The general move in a capitalist market is you don't regulate, you let the market take care of it until the market demonstrates it can't. Then you regulate, and you regulate the minimum amount necessary to get back to the desired outcome, and no more and no less. So how much you do that if you're not going to impose a large scale? Again, I know large is to be fair is a vague term, but the nature and weight of DMA, DSA, GDPR, EU AI Act. Well, a few things you might do if you thought this was a concern. One, the U.S. government has massive buying power. It can put whatever requirements it wants on U.S. purchasing, on federal government purchasing, and it can act as a market actor and move the market through its purchasing power. That seems like an easy way. Number two, I'm a big believer, not surprisingly, in incentivizing before regulating. So try the carrot before the stick, right? Why not say to American AI companies, if you invest in trust, safety, and security, we'll give you a larger tax section for your expenses than you would if you just did it normally, right? Maybe a 2x reduction on dollar for dollar spend, right? It's the same way, by the way, I think we can achieve better cybersecurity. I'd be more in favor of providing a carrot first, see how that goes, allow the market to play itself out with the carrot, and move the market that direction rather than regulate and use the stick first.
Industrial policy is what you're calling for.
Yeah, you call industrial policy, call it incentives. Yeah, I mean, look, by the way, industrial policy is not a dirty word. People tend to think that industrial policy is a dirty word generally, or a dirty word for conservatives. It is not. We have had industrial policy in this country since the dawn of time. We've supported our telecommunications companies. We've supported our defense companies. The United States is not anathema to industrial policy. Conservatives are not anathema to industrial policy. It's just a question of scale, scope, and nature.
Right, well, let's open it up. And our tradition is to give fellows and students a first crack. So I will invite that cohort to put their hands up.
Thanks, Professor Jaffer. And I will say, I am writing an honors thesis right now, advised by Professor Grotto on White House voluntary commitments on AI. So I'm going to ask a question on that, which is that in your presentation, you talk about two extremes: no regulation, regulation. But it strikes me that there's a middle ground of standard setting. Like in the past, we had the NIST cybersecurity framework, and some would say that the White House commitments was a way of standard setting. How do we think about that in non-regulatory frameworks? So you say there should be no standard setting at all?
So I have no problem with companies voluntarily coming to the table. In fact, I'm at a venture capital firm, Paladin Capital, that came in with voluntary investment principles, talking about investing in American companies, allied companies, talking about raising up the priority of trust, safety, and security in investments. So I'm fine with private market actors making voluntary commitments. I'm less comfortable with the government sort of extorting them at sort of breaking them over the coals, saying, hey, if you don't get on these voluntary commitments, we're going to force you to do them. That was a little bit of what went down there, but then the government doubled down on it when they after extracted the voluntary commitments from a handful of AI companies, 5 or 6 at the outset, right? They then double that number up to another 7 or 8, right? So a total of whatever it was, 13, 14 companies, and then out of an effort to make it fair in the marketplace, they imposed all those same regulations, those same voluntary commitments through the EO on the entire industry. Well, it wouldn't be fair to hold the 14 big companies to that if the smaller players aren't held to it. So now everyone gets held to the same standard. So what began as a voluntary commitment, driven just by companies who were willing to do the right thing, ultimately became a regulatory requirement. Yes, the reporting requirement, but ultimately that costs money. It ultimately caused everyone to spend money. And by the way, who's least capable? Well, you wonder why. I think actually JD Vance actually had this right. I am cautious about agreeing with JD Vance on a lot of things, but this is a place where JD Vance isn't exactly right. The fact of the matter is that when you impose costs, those costs are not borne by the companies. They're borne by the end consumers. They ultimately have an impact on the adoption and use of these capabilities. So if we want to limit the use of these capabilities or take them out of the realm of the average American, well, the way to do that is impose costs upon the providers. You might say the same thing about tariffs, but whatever, we won't get into that right now.
We'll share that a little bit, though. But the last part is that consumers are not the only people, like American public. It's also enterprises, right? And can't they face the burden of those costs?
Sure. So let's talk about enterprises. So which amongst the enterprises, let's start with AI companies. Let's talk about the enterprises that are adopting. Start with the AI companies. Who's going to be most likely to be able to absorb the cost of additional regulation on AI? The biggest players, the people with existing market advantage. Who's going to be least able to? The young startups who are going to create the new innovation. They're going to be the ones boxed out. Why do you think some of the leading minds and some of the leading CEOs of AI companies were like, we need to treat AI like global pandemics, right? And nuclear weapons, because they've already got the lead. They want to cement the lead, right? Argue for regulation. It's no surprise Mark Zuckerberg talks about Meta being ready to be regulated, right? Of course they're ready to be regulated. They're the biggest player in the market. They get regulated. It makes it hard for upstarts to come and join them, right? The same is true of adopters. The people most able to sustain the pass down cost of regulation are the big companies. The smaller, younger, startup, most innovative companies be less able to absorb that cost. And by the way, that's how it's playing out in Europe with GDPR, right? It's no surprise that Europeans enforce GDPR primarily against, wait for it, American tech companies. Because GDPR is not about privacy. Do any of you think your privacy has been enhanced by all the website pop-ups you get now? Yes, accept all or deny all cookies, right? Of course not.
Yeah, because you can decline them.
Yeah, and how often do you decline them?
Pretty much all the time.
Yeah. Okay. Great. I bet you if we took a poll, the average American says accept all 90% of the time. I don't know that for a fact, but I bet you most people say accept all. they're not dealing with it, or are randomly picking on any given day what they have time for. But what people aren't doing is doing an informed, well thought out decision about whether they want to trade off their privacy for a benefit.
A large number of people with the Apple OS settings have opted out in America. And that has grown substantially over the last 2 years.
Yep. And guess where that Apple OS setting came from? Private market action, not a regulation.
No, but
Yeah, they do not track.
the point is that people are aware and use these things.
Right. But when do they have the most adoption? When private actors drive it, because the private actors see what consumers actually want and need, something that federal officials, EU officials, members of Congress aren't as well attuned to. The reality is that Apple knows what their consumers want. They're providing that, and there's massive uptake. They were not required, they weren't regulated to do that. They did it because they saw consumer benefit to doing it. If all privacy regulation went that way, we'd have a lot better privacy regulation, a lot broader adoption.
Other fellow students, before I open it up to the broader group, want to jump in? Go ahead.
So I'm Patrick Hume, CSEC fellow this year. Jamil, great to see you. So I had a couple questions. I guess I'll just ask one. So I think I agree with you 99% of the, like 99% of the time. I totally.
I'll take it. I'm gonna go.
That's good. That's it. No, in terms of regulations can stifle growth. That this is important. This is why we have a lot of industrial advantages. But on AI, is there something inherent, at least potentially inherently dangerous about it? This is why people make these analogies to nuclear weapons, right? And so, analogy, say 1945, we say, look, we're going to let companies do whatever they want with this technology. There's a lot of potentially beneficial uses to this technology. It's a lot of energy, and we're not going to do anything until things go wrong, and then we're going to regulate. You say, well, okay, that doesn't sound quite right. This could be very dangerous. Do you find any purchase to that argument, especially where it does seem there is this risk of once you start proliferating some of these algorithms, you can't really put the genie back in the bottle?
So I will say that I've had a couple of recent interactions that have made me question this very question. Like, what about the Skynet problem? I've always sort of like laughed the Skynet problem off, because I just can't imagine a world where we're creating the models and they get so out of control that they're able to sort of take over and start working with agents to sort of to harm us. But then you have really, really smart people, and again, people who might have an advantage because they've got the lead. But you see people like the co-founder of Anthropic, right, Dario Amodei, talk about the dislocations that are going to come and the way that AI is operating. And then you hear from the CISO of Anthropic, who talked. He was on a panel that I was moderating. And he said something to the effect of, I'm not getting this exactly right, so don't quote me on this, but he said something to the effect of, they expect that today Claude writes about 50% of its own code for its own upgrades. It is the one doing the draft. Now, people are reviewing it, editing it, whatever, but it's doing the first draft. They expect that to be upwards of 90% by the end of the year. Again, the numbers may be a little off, but that's about the order of magnitude. They also said that they do have circuit breakers on when, and Claude, Anthropic prides itself on sort of having a point of view, building with trust, safety, and security. They're of the model companies, they're most forward-leaning on this front, in part because they have concerns. But their metric for when the sort of their stock market circuit breaker kicks in is if the AI improves itself by an order of 1,000x in a single year, that's when the circuit breakers kick in. That's a massive improvement. If you think about how good the models are today, just think about the nature and scope of that. So do I worry that like there's a bigger problem out there? Sure. Does that mean that the government can effectively regulate that problem in a way that will both allow innovation to flourish and stop that bad thing from happening? I highly doubt it, because I don't know how many of you have been in Washington, D.C. recently, or watched C-SPAN or flipped the TV on and heard the level of debate that takes place in our federal government or even at your state government. The idea that members of Congress, or even their very smart staffs, informed by very smart young people coming out of Stanford and the like, and AI experts, and there's a lot of good work going to inform Congress and educate them. But the idea that they will be able to figure out the right place to draw the regulation so we can maintain innovation and stop that horrible bad thing, if we could stop it, that would actually be able to effectively stop it. And by the way, we can't even stop our competitors and our adversaries in China and elsewhere from doing this.
Your critique of the BINEO, though, is that Congress should do it. So
Congress is better, yes.
Okay.
Congress is better placed than a bunch of bureaucrats in the executive branch who are not politically accountable, right? But they're not dramatically better because at the end of the day, I'm a believer in private markets driving this innovation and the sort of regulation of it. And by the way, I think it's worked pretty well in technology advancements, right? I mean, there are a lot of people who were deeply worried about the invention of the car and deeply worried about the invention of the computer and deeply worried about the dislocations that the printing press would cause. And all those things, largely in the United States, at least from our mentality, low regulation. Now you might say, well, social media is an exception to that. Look at how bad that's gone and where we're headed with that. I will grant you there are always exceptions to this rule. But as a general matter, the US trend has generated massive innovation and raised incomes in the United States and globally as a result of that technology innovation. Now is probably not the right time to slam the brakes on that thing. Should we be careful? Of course. Should we keep an eye on it? Yes. Is Congress and the executive branch together, even working together, the best place to do it? It's the only one we got. But are they going to do it right? I wouldn't get ahead of it.
So I've got, I'm going to start calling on folks, but I know most of you, but not all of you. Right now on the queue, I've got Colin, Paul, I've got Herb online, and then please tell me your name.
Alana.
Alana, yes, great, awesome.
Great.
All right. Yes, got you.
Thanks for the provocative presentation. A couple of questions about the market. So to the point that companies and investors have incentives to prioritize safety and security. I think what's interesting is if you could say a little bit more about the current racing dynamics involved in racing to AGI and the presumption among the leading companies that there are profound first mover advantages and potentially compounding ones, in part because the models could be capable of recursive self-improvement. And that is leading, so you have a constant set of incentives, according to your argument, to prioritize safety and security. But the companies are not all the same. You highlighted Anthropic as being particularly attuned to these issues. Google's pretty good too. OpenAI is probably somewhere in the middle. Meta, not so much. And then, xAI's Grok 3 and DeepSeek's models are like not great from safety and security. They all face the same market incentives, and yet they have different safety and security performance. So question one is like, what's up with that? How can you explain a variable with a constant? The second thing is, given the coding capabilities that you mentioned, look, already these companies are not hiring more low-level engineers because the model is better than the person who's coming out of Berkeley or Stanford. And that'll be even truer next year and the year after that. The prospect of democratizing the capability to engage in systemic cyber attacks against critical infrastructure is going through the roof. Bio is not far behind. And we know from the most recent testing that the models are getting increasingly deceptive. And they're getting increasingly agentic. So here's the question as it relates to that. What happens when there's a systemic cyber attack by AI or an AI engineered pathogen that kills tens of thousands of people or a rogue AI that's on the loose in the internet? What does that do to regulation? Like, might it be better actually to set regulation at 4 now? Because I guarantee you after an AI 9/11, it's going to be dialed to 11. Well, so isn't it better to be at 4? If you like, EU is at 10 or 8, US is at 1. Wouldn't it be better to crank it to 4 or 5? Because after an incident, it's going to 11.
I really hate this last argument that you just made because it is exactly the same argument that I make about all sorts of regulation, right? It is better to regulate in the calm of today than the emergency of tomorrow, right? Whether that's on surveillance or on cybersecurity or the like. When you regulate under stress conditions, you're going to get worse outcomes. You're going to get things that are worse for privacy, safety, security. Things that are worse for industry, worse for innovation, worse across the board. So you're right. If we have to pick between regulate now or regulate later, better regulate now in the calm of the moment, right? I would also argue, though, that we are in not a particularly calm moment for all the reasons you've laid out, right? People are worried about what that AI, nuclear winter looks like if there's a bio attack or a systemic cyber attack or even worse. And I think those are a little different than the AI loose on the internet, right, doing its own thing and agentically operating and improving its own code and trying to manipulate humans into behaviors that ultimately result in its own success and not the success of humanity globally. I agree that you'll get worse outcomes if we end up in any of those scenarios. And so to the extent that we're going to do something sooner in the calm is better. With respect to your question, there was a further question in that part of the question. Let me answer the rest of that. What was the rest of that question?
Just the racing dynamics, the AGI, and if there's a constant market incentive for safety and security, why do you see variable performance in the biggest company?
That is a great question that I don't have a good answer to, and a question that needs a lot more study and a lot more analysis. I don't have an answer to that. There are clearly some companies who see it to their advantage to be viewed as the company that has more trust, safety, and security, that has models that are built around certain sets of values and the like. And there are other companies that see an incentive to be built around other values or no values at all, or complete anarchic freedom, right? And so why they have those values and why they both think they can make money doing it, right? What are the market forces that are driving that? Is a great question, something that needs to be studied, and one that I'll think more about, but I don't have a good answer for you on that today. I think you're right that there is a general market incentive towards making more and more capable models. You do see these companies, though, holding back the most capable models even today. Right? Even today, we know that OpenAI's capabilities that is not publicly released. Claude, Anthropic has made clear they have significant capabilities that they're not prepared to release yet, even in the race dynamic. And so the question is, why are they holding back? What's causing them to hold back? And I think it's because they're seeing the very type of agentic behavior that you're describing, and they can't. I don't know for sure. My instinct is they're seeing that type of agentic behavior that you're concerned about, and they're trying to figure out how to control it and put the guardrails in themselves. Why they would do that in a world in which DeepSeek puts out a model that's going a lot faster, and how long they can survive doing that, it's unclear, right? And Llama, same thing, putting out open source capabilities. I do think that on this question of democratization, that's why I do believe that there's value in both closed source and open source. As a general matter, my belief tends to be that the profit dynamic will drive closed source models to be better, but that hasn't been true in recent memory, right? There have been times in which Llama has accelerated beyond some of the more capable closed models, but not always. And DeepSeek did at one point accelerate past it, as far as we can tell, right? If we believe the amounts of time and effort they put into it. And remember, it's hard to really know because the Chinese government could be pouring tons of money behind the scenes that we don't know about. It's just harder to really know whether that's a manipulation of the market by the government. Did that answer you had a first question? I don't think I answered your first question. Remind me the first question.
I think it gets towards it. I just think you need to think more about how the racing dynamic.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer.
And I think it's actually, there's a lot about organizational culture in these places,
yeah,
not about market incentives. Because I think there are some companies that either will play fast and loose to be first,
yeah,
or if somebody puts out a better model, will skip steps and accelerate the release of things. That's what I think happened with Grok 3.
Yeah.
Or they're cheating the system like DeepSeek. So I just think there are a lot of layers here that are not captured in generic market incentives.
Yeah.
That need to be thought through. And we're at a particular moment where every company that's going for AGI thinks the one to cross the finish line first gets almost unlimited first mover advantages. They might be wrong, but they believe it. And as long as they believe it and act towards it, then it's real.
Interesting. The corporate dynamics are something that you have to account for. I mean, you just saw what happened, a year or so ago with Altman and the OpenAI board and all the bloodbath that went and the firing and then the rehiring and all that stuff. So you're right. How we evaluate those, how we measure and evaluate those relative to other market dynamics is a very hard question. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's very interesting.
Paul, you're next.
Yeah, it's just related to college, but it's not exactly the same. So you showed us a lot about a kind of average, generic economic development, market capitalization.
It's a fair critique. I'm going to tell you up front, it's a fair critique.
Okay, that's not a critique.
Well, it's coming. I can feel it.
So far, so good, Paul.
This particular case,
yeah,
it's not the average that matters. It's the exceptions that matter. And the way I would put this is, you're waiting for the Skynet emergency when it takes over and kills everyone. I mean, I'm waiting for it too, and maybe it'll happen. I don't actually think so either. But there's an emergency happening right now in our government, and some of it is Elon Musk using AI for purposes that are vague. We don't really know exactly what's happening, but we do know that surveillance and deportation and all the kinds of nefarious crap that this government is up to now are being, AI is being used to suck in data, to process it, to identify people, and so on. So that crisis is already happening.
Yeah.
And that's actually a minor version of what can happen if this government goes where it's going. So, but the generic argument I want to make is, again, that it's as if you let every company build its own nuclear weapon, and you say most companies are not going to explode because they're going to be safe, responsible companies. But the one company that does that is the one that matters.
So I think you made two separate but related points, right? One is about our government and where it's at currently and where it may be headed. And I share your view that the trend lines are very concerning. And funny enough, should be very concerning to the base of people that voted for President Trump, right? Most of the I think the MAGA voting base is a generally anti-government, concerned about government, interested in keeping their firearms, right? Pro Second Amendment, concerned about the jackbooted thugs of the FBI base, right? And by the way, that's a very natural American trend. That's where our founders came from, right? They built the entire Constitution and our separation of powers and our first 10 amendments around this idea of concern about an overweening government power. An overweening government power willing to wield that and having the tool of AI at its fingertips, and dominated by people who understand and know how to use this capability or know enough to make it to be dangerous with that capability is a very concerning thing. It should be troubling to all Americans, and to anybody who believes in the cause of freedom, right? What you do about that now that that's where we are, right, is a much harder question, right? And how to respond to that, how to deal with that. That's less an AI problem and more what's the government going to do with powerful tools? This same government has, the entire U.S. military at its discretion. Of course, there will be people who don't agree, who don't obey if they're given unlawful instructions. Has nuclear weapons at its fingertips, right? I mean, there are a lot of things to be concerned about, right? About if you're worried about the federal government gone rogue, AI is probably a big one, but probably not the biggest one, right? But a big one and a growing one to be sure. The separate question that you ask about companies having building nuclear weapons and one deciding to use it is a very fair criticism and concern. I guess, and maybe I'm open to being completely wrong about this. I don't think of AI as of the scale or scope of a nuclear weapon or global pandemic as those who are concerned about AI risk do. Why that is, and whether I'm right or wrong, whether we should bank on my gut instinct on that is probably a fair point. And I think I need to think more about the data about why I don't think that's right, particularly in light of some of the smartest people who created this stuff and who are making lots of money selling the stuff disagree with me, right? And I've thought a lot about it. I don't have a good answer on that, but that's probably my best answer to your nuclear weapons question, because if we think AI is a nuclear weapon, right, or has that capability, then allowing private companies to develop it with reckless abandon and allowing one to potentially go rogue. I guess the only thing I could say is something I said sort of earlier, which is, if it's going to happen, it will happen in China or somewhere else and not necessarily the US. Yes, we're furthest ahead, so might delay it by a little bit, but how much, it's hard to know. DeepSeek's a good example of where we might just miss it.
So we're really short on time, which I think is a testament to the energy of the conversation. What I'm going to do is I've got a question from her. I'm going to read it. I'm going to ask Alana and Jim to get the questions on the table and let you wrap up with those questions as background. So Herblin asks, you said customers have incentives to use companies that provide safety, et cetera, but that's for their own safety. So this is an externalities question. What about for public risks to everyone? What if those risks are catastrophic? Where if you see it once, it's usually destructive.
Can I just give a fast answer to that?
Yeah, fast.
Yeah. So if there's a market failure and the market isn't accounting for a common good, a public good problem, tragedy commons, then that's actually the one place where I think regulation does make sense, right? That's the place where I think every economist would tell you that's the place for regulation to step in, even the most conservative economists in the world. But I don't know that we're there. We've identified that yet.
All right, Alana and Jim.
I just wanted to kind of bring up the premise of the talk is focused on these kind of laminations of like national boundaries in AI. And I wonder if you take like AI to its logical conclusion, do these national boundaries really mean anything anymore? And instead, is it perhaps a change in regulatory governance altogether on a global scale? So I wonder how much of the focus on national boundaries and GDP is a moment in time that's quickly going to pass.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Hi, Jim Goldberg. I'm here at TSAC. So I was interested in the 72% who want more regulation, but but it doesn't, I mean, I'm trying to think about like what would lead them to want more, like how much do they even know about AI? Are they, you know, is there something out there that they're like, oh, I'm worried about this thing? But it would really only be meaningful to me if I knew how much regulation they wanted for other things.
Yeah, and they said it needs to. What they said. I'll come to your question, Alana, in just a second. They said it needs to be managed carefully. They didn't. That was a. I want to put it out there because it was such a dramatic number, and it compared. It showed the U.S. to Europe, an unusual trend, right? So I wanted to highlight that number, but it's not a very detailed number, and it's not even about regulation specifically. It's just about it needs to be managed carefully, right? Or that was some term like that. So it's a great question. I think if we dig deeper, there is some data in the Stanford study that bears further detailed analysis, and probably with the cost having some of these surveys, we'll be able to get a better, more detailed answer to that question. Alana, to your question, you're right that it may be the case that we need to think on in terms of global policy and the like. The reality today, though, of course, is that we're making policy by the nation-state methodology. EU's acting, the U.S. Congress is thinking about acting, various states are acting, right? So you're right that in the long run, and there are efforts. The G7 have an ongoing effort. The UN has some principles that they're talking about. So there are ongoing efforts to talk about some of these things from a global perspective. But remember, some of the global players, as we've seen in the cybersecurity domain, right, have fundamentally different views about what cybersecurity, in this case, AI regulation, might mean to them. You take China and Russia on one side. To them, cybersecurity is about how they control their populations and being left free from other governments regulating how they deal with their own populations. We talk about cybersecurity. We talk about tragedy that comes. We talk about attacks on critical infrastructure. We talk about protecting our citizens from outside attacks. The U.S.-EU view is different fundamentally than the Chinese-Russian view. Bizarrely, we somehow seem to come together on a UN cyber crime charter that I think is actually disastrously bad, and we should not adopt. But the U.S. voted in favor of it a few months back towards the end of the Biden administration. So, color me confused.
Well, with that, I'm going to thank you for spending lunchtime with us. Thank you all for joining the session, and we'll call it to a close.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brad.